LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the hidden story of the life we breathe. If you look out at the empty space in front of you, what do you see? Nothing. The absence of stuff. Early philosophers, including Aristotle and Plato, imagined a pure divine essence permeating all space, weaving silently through planets and stars. It wasn't until the 18th century that we began to discover oxygen and other gases in the air, vital substances for life, combustion, and respiration. By the late 19th and 20th centuries, aerobiology emerged, uncovering a new unseen world. That empty space around us turns out to be teeming with invisible microbial life carrying pollen, spores, bacteria, and viruses, all inhaled into our bodies with every breath we take. Thus, what began as a poetic, mystical belief transformed through science into a profound truth. Air is substance, alive and brimming with unseen wonders. A discovery that's a testament to humanity's enduring curiosity and the universe's infinite depth. My guest today, Carl Zimmer, has written a book about those unseen wonders. It's called Airborne: The Hidden History of the Life We Breathe. Carl is a columnist for the New York Times and the author of 14 other books about science, including Life's Edge and She Has Her Mother's Laugh. He is also, I'm pretty sure, the first guest we've ever had on the show who has an asteroid and a species of tapeworm named after him. We covered a lot in our conversation, from the rogue scientist who scaled glaciers to prove life exists in thin, frigid air, to the ongoing war between humans and airborne pathogens, some of which are being created by humans. We talk about indoor and outdoor pollution, air as a form of diet, and the benefits of breathing woodland eucalyptus dust. We also talked about the current strain of bird flu, which Carl has been writing about for the New York Times, and the potential that it could go airborne. I asked him, how worried should we be?
I'd say very worried. This is not a virus that's under control.
But we began by discussing the shocking scale of the invisible life that is floating, swirling, whirling, and careening all around us.
Want better ad performance? Rated #1 in targeting on G2, StackAdapt provides access to premium audiences and top-performing ad placements. Visit go.stackadapt.com/LinkedIn and launch winning campaigns today.
I'm Tomer Cohen, LinkedIn's Chief Product Officer. If you're just as curious as I am about the way things are built, then tune into my podcast, Building One. I speak with some of the best product builders out there.
I've always been inspired by frustration.
It came back to my own personal pain point.
So we had to go out to farmers and convince them.
Following that curiosity is a superpower.
You have to be obsessed with the human condition.
Listen to Building One on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Carl Zimmer, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thanks for having me.
You know, not long ago, Carl, as you know, many reasonable people would have claimed that the space in front of me, I'm waving my arms, it's clearly empty. We now know that, the air that surrounds us is billowing with life. I love this description. You say the earth is the floor of a living ocean of life, right? So have you been surprised in your research for this book by the scale of the life that is floating around us in what you call the aerobiome?
Yeah, I have been surprised. I mean, I thought I kind of knew about the life in the air, but when I really started to do research and talk to these scientists who you can call aerobiologists, they would start talking in numbers where I'd write things down and then I write them down again because I just wanted to be sure that I got it right. Because there seemed to be too many zeros involved.
Right.
I keep this list with me. So like one white mulberry tree in a single springtime will produce 486 billion grains of pollen.
Wow.
That's one tree.
Right.
And so, yeah. And when you talk about bacteria, there are probably a trillion bacteria that rise up in the atmosphere every year, and then they come back down. So yeah, the numbers are kind of hard to reckon with, but that's our world.
Yeah. And every day we're breathing in 2,000 gallons of air, as you say, composed of Lord knows how many thousands of living things. And I guess we've also learned that some of these pathogens and living things floating in the air travel over much larger distances than we previously believed.
You can imagine, something getting lofted into the air and then dropping right back down. I mean, that kind of like, throwing a football into the air.
Yeah.
But the fact is that if a spore of moss gets ejected up into the air and just happens to get carried up by some air currents, it can just keep going and going up and up and up, miles into the air. And then the patterns of movement in the upper atmosphere can just take it for literally thousands of miles.
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples is volcanoes in Antarctica. When these explorers climb up these volcanoes, the sides obviously are covered in ice and snow, and then they finally get to the top where the heat of the volcano melts away a little, and they'll find little pads of moss. And, you can look at their DNA and you can see like, oh, these are related to moss in places like New Zealand. It's clear that these things came from a really, really long distance away. And that's actually not that unusual, in the sense that things are probably like crossing the ocean all the time. And so you're breathing those things too. So you might be breathing, some fungus that got its start in China a few days ago.
It's astounding. Yeah, I've always been fascinated by how these volcanic islands, in the middle of the Pacific, like the Hawaiian Islands, went from molten lava to these just flourishing ecosystems exploding with biodiversity. And I always imagine like birds pooping seeds and, driftwood carrying mice or whatever. But clearly, I had not recognized previously that there were just these spores floating miles high that were probably part of that story.
Birds certainly do matter. They'll get stuff stuck on their feet and they fly off and then land and they distribute them somewhere else. But, there've only been birds flying around for, only 150 million years. And there's been life on Earth for over 3.5 billion years. And the fact is that as soon as there was life in the ocean, it was going up into the air, because we know that when waves crash on the beach, they are shooting up huge numbers of living things. I mean, scientists can measure them. They can actually like capture them and see how it is that these waves create tiny droplets that then get kicked up. So this airborne life, what scientists sometimes call the aerobiome, it probably has existed pretty much since life itself began, and even before there was life on land.
I loved your description of that. You wrote that when waves crash, the pounding surf lofts billions of microbes into the air. So it's almost like waves are a kind of factory or method of transmission from the biome of the sea and the life in the air, right? I mean, they're like factories of the transmission of life into the air, it seems.
Absolutely, the oceans and then the land just sort of added to that because life came on land. Probably the first life on land might have been like bacterial mats, maybe 3 billion years ago or so. Mm-hmm. Like the fossil record suggests that they were already starting to spread onto land. Sometimes these are called crusts. And you can still go to, some really, desolate places on Earth, and all that can survive there are these microbial crusts. But there was a time when all the continents were covered with those crusts. And probably what happened was that, they sort of crept onto land. They were adapted for being exposed to the air. And then winds would come along and they would scrape up some of these bacteria and other organisms and carry them. And they would land and sort of seed another part of the land. And so basically, there's a good reason to think that life in the air spread life across the continents. And then once you get plants and fungi into the action about 400 million years ago, then boom, like suddenly the aerobiome is just getting flooded with spores from the plants and the fungi themselves. Now they're going to take advantage of the air. They're sort of actually adapting and being like, okay, this is how we are going to have sex. This is how we're going to reproduce. We're going to use the air. And so suddenly you're just flooded with much more stuff.
And your interest in this topic, as I understand it, began with COVID, your desire to really dig into airborne life. Is that right? Is that what sparked your interest?
Yeah, I'd say that was the seed, because when the pandemic was unfolding, a bunch of us reporters were trying to cover the news of the pandemic and just trying to help readers to know what we're dealing with. And, the fact is we were dealing with a new disease. I mean, this virus had not existed the year before. And that's just what happens when you have emerging diseases. So we were talking with scientists who themselves were trying to learn about this thing as fast as they could on the fly. They were learning really fast. There were a lot of debates, but one of the sharpest disagreements and one of the fiercest arguments was about how is it spreading?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you would have, the World Health Organization really like trying to bang down this what they considered a dangerous idea that COVID was airborne. But, there were lots of scientists, including some I had reported on in the past, who are the ones who are saying, like, we need to take seriously the possibility that COVID is airborne. And, eventually, like, everyone came to a general consensus that, yes, COVID is airborne. And I just thought, what just happened? Like, why was that so hard? Like, I get, sequencing the genome of the coronavirus. I get it. That's hard.
Yeah.
But just saying, is this airborne or not, that to me, naively, it didn't seem like it would be as hard. And so I talked to scientists like, what just happened? And they said, well, you need to understand that this is part of a bigger story. This is a part of an older story, a bigger story about the life in the air. And that just sent me down this fascinating journey to be learning about life in the air and this long-running history of this debate about what exactly is in the air and how much of a threat does it pose to us.
It's so interesting that you said that sequencing the genome should take a long time, but it shouldn't have taken us upwards of 2 years to figure out that COVID was airborne. Meanwhile, sequencing the genome only took a matter of days, right?
Yeah,
with modern technologies, right? So, but why do you think there was this resistance? Do you think there's sort of a bias or some kind of blinders that we have to the airborne story?
In the words of one scientist who I talked to, he said, history set us up. It really sort of, challenges our ideas that science is just simply some sort of straight line of progress where facts are discovered and then everyone says, great, and then they just go on from there. Science, it does advance, but it advances in messy ways and in counterintuitive ways. And just sometimes people just bring forward really valuable ideas and discoveries and then get ignored or cast aside. I'd say that part of the issue was that the amazing scientists who discovered the germ theory of disease and really established it in the late 1800s, they sort of rewrote history so that before they would show that, cholera is caused by bacteria and contaminated water, people would say, oh, no, it's caused by miasmas. It's caused by these corruptions of the air. Like somehow the air itself became dangerous. And so these architects of the germ theory of disease and the public health experts who tried to build a new kind of public health based on that, they were like, okay, air, we don't have to worry about that for infectious disease. They just said people should just be relieved that you can relax. The air is not going to kill you.
Right.
And that really took hold. And even though, like in the 1930s, as I write in the book, there this husband and wife team, William and Mildred Wells, who did a whole string of amazing experiments that really showed that, actually germs can potentially travel through the air and can potentially spread disease, and even found a way to stop them in the air. And yet people forgot about them. I mean, and actually in the COVID pandemic, a lot of scientists themselves had to rediscover William and Mildred Wells.
Well, so it turns out that the history of the discovery of the microbiome, which was new to you as you investigated this in recent years, and I think is probably new to most of our listeners, is wildly colorful and interesting with great characters and surprising adventures. Where do you tend to begin? Maybe it's with Louis Pasteur and his daring do.
There's so many fascinating stories that I discovered for myself. I mean, and I don't think a lot of people knew about them either. And we all know about Louis Pasteur, but we imagine him, developing the rabies vaccine or, making these discoveries that get remembered, with the pasteurization of milk, all that sort of stuff. But before then, in the 1850s, he was in this battle over really the nature of life itself. Mm-hmm. And he had come to the decision that, all microbes descend from other microbes. In other words, the cells divide and they make more cells. And I know that sounds simple and obvious, but at the time it was kind of controversial because a lot of people believed that bacteria and other microbes, they spontaneously generated from decaying matter. So this is the idea of spontaneous generation. And, Pasteur had made these observations. He was asked to go into a factory where they were fermenting beet juice into alcohol, and it wasn't working in some of the tanks. And he's like, well, that's because there's some bad bacteria in there. How did it get there? He just said they just came through the air. And people are like, are you crazy? There's stuff in the air? And he's like, yeah, I think there's stuff in the air. And and he got into a big fight, and he started doing a series of experiments to say, like, look, I'm going to find life in the air. And so he crafted these flasks with these long necks, and he started going places and just holding them out. They were full of sterile broth. And his idea was that if there are germs in the air, they'll make it down this long neck and fall into the broth, and then I will be able to grow them. And he was able to do that in the streets of Paris, and then he went out to the countryside and he did it there. And my favorite example of this was that he climbed a glacier because he was sure that he would find life there, and he did. And there's this painting I just love someone made later of him waving this glass flask around in the air on top of a glacier. And, you can only imagine if someone came walking along, they would have thought, I think this guy's crazy. And right. I think people really did think he was crazy. There's actually a journalist at the time who said along the lines of, the world that you want to lead us into is too fantastic to believe. But he was right.
Well, so it took us a while, but we eventually figured out that life is airborne in quantities and at elevations that I think continue to surprise us. How do you think that we should think about these swarms of life in the air from a health perspective? I mean, you've written, Carl, extensively about evolution in books like Evolution, The Triumph of an Idea, Parasite Rex, Microcosm, and you talk about host-pathogen coevolution. This notion that we've been in a kind of arms race with pathogens for an extremely long time. Do you see the air as kind of one of the theaters in which this war is playing out between, in our case, humans and pathogens?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the air became a route by which pathogens could get from host to host. Pathogens are really good at finding lots of different ways of getting from host to host. Some are sexually transmitted and some just spread through water and so on. And then there are some that go through the air. And I think that when we started to live in buildings, we actually made it even easier and a more attractive way to get around. At the same time, however, there's a lot of stuff in the air. We're breathing living things. Who knows how many things we've inhaled in this conversation. And neither of us is like keeling over from some deadly disease. For the most part, these things they're harmless. And so, it's possible that our immune systems, just kill things off that we inhale, but it's also likely that we just we do tolerate some of them. So actually some things will just set up residence inside of us. So, your mouth, your nose, your throat, they're all packed with all sorts of living things, fungi, viruses, bacteria, and a fair number of those you probably inhaled. And if you have a healthy immune system, you're fine. So we have had a war with pathogens, but we've also had a negotiation and a settlement over hundreds of millions of years. Because if our immune system was aggressively attacking everything that entered our airway, we would just scar our lungs and die. We cannot be constantly waging war. And so we've evolved a very sophisticated balance. Unfortunately, it's still the case that sometimes we inhale things and we get sick. Over a million people die of tuberculosis every year. That's a testament to airborne infection.
I love your description about what happens when we breathe in living things in the air. You write, it begins in the nose where mucus-coated hairs trap incoming particles. I was very happy to be able to tell my wife, reading your book, that my mucus-coated hairs in my nose are actually a highly evolved adaptation that makes me biologically fit. But then we have hair-like cilia that line the airways down to our lungs, rippling like seagrass, right, with microbe-killing compounds. So we are highly, highly evolved specifically to interact with, and as you say, kind of negotiate with all this kind of abundant life in the air.
Yeah, but at the same time, we are in this kind of an arms race with some of these things. And so with tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it has kind of hijacked some of those defenses. So tuberculosis, like those bacteria, only spread by air. And they have evolved to essentially tickle those hairs and trigger a coughing reflex. Tuberculosis is very famous for its cough. It's just this terrible hacking cough. And that is due in part to the bacteria themselves saying, like, if I get this person to cough, I'm going to be able to get out and I'm going to be able to infect somebody else. I'm going to float through the air and find another victim. It goes both ways.
Yeah, for sure. And then of course, there's the additional factor that we've had some humans aiding the pathogens. You write about the dark history of the U.S. and Russia recruiting aerobiologists during World War II and thereafter. How spooky is this history? And is it history?
I don't think any history is history. I think we're always living with it. And in the case of biological warfare, I was finding some really remarkable demonstrations that the connection to early aerobiology is just super clear and obvious. And so you have these people I mentioned, like William and Mildred Wells, who are trying to protect us from airborne diseases that we might pass to each other, particularly indoors. And in World War II, the U.S. Army said, we want to look into biological weapons. We want to understand them because we're worried that our enemies will use them, and we want to develop them. And so they went to some of these original aerobiologists and said, come work with us. And then they took ideas from these early aerobiologists like William Wells. He didn't know about this at all until after the war, and he was horrified. And the Army basically said, the best way to spread disease is through the air. So we were going to make airborne biological weapons. We're going to make anthrax bombs. We're also going to make bombs full of spores, fungi that will kill wheat to disable enemy armies. And they did. They built all these things. And at the end of World War II, they didn't stop until it just got to terrifying proportions. I mean, the U.S. probably had enough of this fungus that kills wheat to kill all the wheat in the world.
Wow.
And the Soviet Union was doing similar stuff as well. They even had an accident in 1979 in one of their factories for anthrax, killed a bunch of people downwind. And, at the fall of the Soviet Union, it's not really clear where that stuff went. You can draw a straight line to the Iraq War because that was a central justification for entering the war, which was, Colin Powell at the UN waving around a vial as if it was full of anthrax, saying, we have to go in to Iraq because of this thing that I'm holding. It was one of the justifications. Saddam Hussein had destroyed his biological weapons by then, so it was not justified, but the fear changed history.
Right. And you write that a shroud of secrecy fell across much of aerobiology after this chemical weapons development. And you say, even today, we're not entirely free of it. Did you encounter this in your research?
Sure. We know that, a lot of the research that was carried out by the United States government at Camp Detrick, now Fort Detrick, was classified. And a lot of it still remains classified. So there's a lot that's shrouded in secrecy, and it's too bad in the sense that it's possible that we could have actually learned some important things about sort of basic science and health from some of the work that they did, as grotesque as it was. Some aerobiologists that talk to say, I bet like some of the best evidence of airborne disease was done in these classified programs.
Interesting. And so technology, of course, cuts both ways. As we were talking about earlier, our rapid response to COVID benefited from machine learning. And so I could imagine that one could make the case that right now we have an asymmetrical advantage on the side of humans trying to stop pathogens. At the same time, we know that, that artificial intelligence and other, technologies can also be used to create pathogens. How do you think of the state of play in the evolutionary battle that we've been discussing right now?
Certainly, artificial intelligence is moving into the world of pandemics in the sense that, people are looking for ways that you can use artificial intelligence to be able to speed up detecting pathogens, in the air, for example, based on their DNA or their RNA, and looking for patterns in how diseases are spreading, so that, AI might be able to pick up patterns that human epidemiologists just, need a little more time to see. Other people are trying to use AI to say, okay, there are all this vast number of viruses in animals. Which ones of them are most likely to spill over and be our next pandemic? Which ones do we need to keep our eye on? And so there's a lot of work going on with that. There are people who are concerned about biodefense, concerned about terrorism using biology. They're worried about people who might use AI to better design pathogens that can work as weapons. AI scientists themselves have been saying, we need to figure out ways to stop that. We can't let AI be used to develop modifications to pathogens,
right.
Modifying their proteins and so on to be even more deadly.
That's right. Yeah, and I know I've heard Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, one of the leading AI companies, talking specifically about the work that they're doing to make sure that their artificial intelligence is not used in negative ways. And I think this specific use case of biohacking is one that they do a lot of testing around, and we have to hope that everyone is doing that. And I guess on the other side, you have, the ability to have, detection systems, and as you say, to anticipate all the ways in which all the existing viruses and pathogens that exist among animals and elsewhere, to be able to see a few steps ahead what potential mutations could occur, that potentially gives us a defensive advantage.
It does to some extent. On the other hand, you cannot deal with a pandemic without a strong public health system.
Yes.
And, AI is not going to invest in your community hospitals. It's not going to do that. And so if in places like the United States, public health continues to be neglected, we are going to be putting ourselves at greater risk.
Coming up, Carl explains why he's worried about bird flu and what we should be doing about it.
Your ads deserve better. Smarter targeting, premium cross-channel placements, and simplified measurement all in one platform. StackAdapt is the leading ad buying platform for end-to-end performance. StackAdapt is ranked the #1 DSP on G2. It's the ad platform you need for campaign success. See why the best marketers are switching to StackAdapt at go.stackadapt.com/LinkedIn.
I'm Tomer Cohen, LinkedIn's Chief Product Officer. If you're just as curious as I am about the way things are built, the insights behind what it takes to create a world-renowned product, then tune into my podcast, Building One. There's so much to learn, like how Patagonia innovates with its supply chain.
We had to go out to farmers and convince them. It was really damn hard.
Or the way Adobe thinks about the first interaction somebody has with Photoshop.
I was always so fascinated by how people navigate and find their way.
Ever wanted to know how Nike builds emotion into the Jordan brand?
You have to be obsessed with the current state of the human condition.
And it doesn't stop there. What about how Glean reinvented knowledge search with AI? You can learn about how a Michelin star chef is redesigning seeds for flavor and how Pixar is nurturing a creative culture. Listen to Building One on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's talk about the latest bird flu, H5N1, which you've been covering for the New York Times. Right now, as I understand it, it's relatively contained, affecting mostly birds and animals. I think it's killed one human, but it's not yet transmissible between humans, to our knowledge. How worried should listeners be about this?
I'd say very worried.
Wow.
And I would say that it's true that, quote unquote, only one person has died, but, this is not a virus that's under control. This is a virus that keeps spreading to more cows in more states. The fact that it's in cows that alone is very unsettling because, H5N1 as a bird flu, it was discovered in 1996. And there it was infecting chickens, ducks, and also infecting wild birds. And people have had their eye on it for a long time, thinking, we really hope it doesn't spill over directly to humans, because about half of people who picked it up from, handling a chicken or something, they died. So this was looking like an incredibly lethal thing. So then in the past couple of years, there started to be a lot of reports of H5N1, a particular branch of H5N1 starting to infect seals, other marine mammals. And so it was spilling over into other mammals, which was worrisome. And then last year, it started showing up in cows in the United States. And that was weird. Like H5N1 had never been seen in cows before, and it's continuing to spread among them. So dairy workers are getting exposed to it. Veterinarians are getting exposed to it. And some of them don't even show symptoms. They end up with antibodies to it. So we know they got sick, but we're not keeping track of it. We don't know how many people have gotten sick from cows. And then, just to add one more thing to this, cats. Cats have been picking it up, and they probably got it from the cows or maybe directly from birds, but there are a lot of cats that are getting sick with bird flu. and people have cats in their houses. And so there's another opportunity for a spillover. So this is not a good situation we're in by any means. People tend to think of emerging diseases like, oh, it's happening over there. Oh, Ebola, it's off in Africa. Oh, COVID, that's in China where bad things happen. Like that's how Americans think about it.
Yeah.
This is happening right here in the United States. I live in a town, Guilford, Connecticut, a little town. A mile away from me, a little flock of backyard ducks had to be killed because they had all gotten bird flu. It's all over the place.
And when it's all over the place, it means that it has more opportunities to mutate. I mean, you had a recent New York Times piece in which you quoted a virologist who said, and I think the closing line of the piece, what's shocking to me is that we're letting nature do this experiment.
Yeah.
So it's not a trivial thing that this is spreading at scale among livestock and now cats and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I am a co-author on an evolution textbook, and we use influenza and COVID as just sort of a basic introductory example of how evolution works. And the reason we do that is because viruses, they get cells to make copies of them. And the cells are kind of sloppy about it, which means that viruses have an incredibly high mutation rate. And so when you get sick and viruses are replicating inside of you, they are just, first of all, there are tons of viruses inside of you when you get sick, and the mutation rate is high. So you have all sorts of mutants. A lot of them go nowhere. A lot of them just are dead, basically. But there's always a chance there that one of them is going to have a great combination. And the problem with flu is that it has this knack where, you might get infected with two different flu viruses at once. And then they get into one cell, and then they do a little bit of sort of viral sex, where basically the genes from two different viruses get mixed together into a new hybrid offspring, which sort of has the best of both worlds. And these are called reassortants. And pandemics can start from just one reassortant. That's all it takes. So, so that's why I'm very concerned, and I wish more people were concerned too.
And so just closing the conversation about H5N1, I understand that we do have a vaccine, although limited supplies of it. What should we be doing that we're not doing to address H5N1 and I guess potentially other future threats?
Influenza, I would say in general, is a really big challenge in terms of trying to protect ourselves. I mean, it's not easy. Part of the problem is that birds have a lot of different strains of influenza, way more than we do. For the most part, they're actually harmless. And they're in their guts and they poop them out. And so there's a bottomless source of new flu viruses, unfortunately, potential new flu viruses. And these are birds. So, I consider them part of the aerobiome. They get around, So you have wild birds who will go between continents and they will take viruses with them. So this is how an influenza virus gets airborne, one of the ways. I mean, it can get airborne because we breathe and we exhale it and someone else near us inhales it. But a bird can just take it 1,000 miles and seed it someplace new. So how do you, we're not going to like put a net over all of our farms and keep out all the birds. I mean, it's absurd. So I think there does need to be a lot of testing, a lot more testing, a lot of testing of cows, which is not a standard thing. It's just, they're not really considered sort of part of our kind of public health system enough.
Yeah.
So I think there should be, I would argue that it needs to be a lot more testing of cows just to begin with. Vaccines are definitely important. I have written for 15 years, maybe 20 years about, the ongoing quest for what's known as a universal influenza vaccine so that we wouldn't have to worry about every new pandemic and every new seasonal strain. Like you could get a vaccine for the flu, all flu, once, maybe twice in your life. You wouldn't need to get it every year. And it's It's tough. I mean, there's a road that we could take to get there, but it's going to take a lot more support and more resources.
Yeah. Let's talk about climate change and airborne disease. Obviously, the increase in extreme weather events and wildfires has caused the American public, certainly, and I'm sure people around the world, to be far more concerned about air quality. And it's air quality is one of these things that is a non-issue until it is an issue. And we even had a scare here in New York City with smoke coming down from Canada, which was a real wake-up call for a lot of people that I know. And obviously, we know a lot of people in California who've been struggling with this for a while. We now have many filters, in our apartment, which we didn't used to have. How do you think about the intersection of climate change and the health of our aerobiome?
So, climate change is changing everything. It is a global phenomenon, and the aerobiome is everywhere. It surrounds the whole planet, and so not surprisingly, climate is changing the aerobiome. So you mentioned fire, for example.
Yeah.
So it's just been in the past few years that scientists have been discovering that wildfires themselves actually inject huge numbers of bacteria, fungi, and other organisms high into the atmosphere. And you might think, that doesn't make any sense. Like a fire should just burn and kill anything. But what happens is it creates these incredibly powerful updrafts that actually suck microbes out of the soil, strip them off of of bark and leaves, and don't burn them directly. They just kind of loft them into the air. This is another one of these numbers I find kind of amazing. So that a scientist named Lita Kobziar at University of Idaho estimates that every second during a wildfire, every square meter is sending up 170,000 cells into the air.
Wow.
So it's actually, wildfires are actually a major source of the aerobiome, it turns out. Nobody realized that until just recently, thanks to her work in large part. And there are going to be more wildfires with climate change. One other thing I'll mention is that climate change is going to expand certain areas of arid land because rainfall patterns are going to change. And in the arid areas of the western United States, there's a fungus that's in the ground, and it just sits there doing its business, being a happy desert fungus. But when the wind scours the land and kicks up these spores, they can travel for hundreds of thousands of miles. And then if people inhale them, they develop as a disease called valley fever. This is not something you want to get. It is a slow, grinding, terrible death.
Oh my gosh.
It's not a lot of good treatments for it. It's bad. And the cases are on the rise, and scientists are projecting that as the arid land increases in the western United States, the range where people will get valley fever is also going to expand.
Well, just in case there are any listeners out there who are not adequately concerned about possible future problems, I'm also, there's also thawing permafrost, right? There's a concern that long dormant zombie pathogens could be released. I understand that in 2016, a heat wave in Siberia thawed permafrost and led to an anthrax outbreak from a frozen reindeer carcass.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, I think anthrax is the least interesting of the potential things that can happen because the fact is you don't need some old frozen carcass to deliver anthrax. Anthrax is unfortunately quite common and is a serious issue for livestock and so on. What I wonder about are viruses and other things that are in the permafrost that have been extinct for thousands of years.
Right.
And if they are viable and, the permafrost thaws, they could very well be pulled up into the aerobiome and they could then potentially travel and cause some harm. Yeah.
Well, and then if we didn't have enough things here to worry about, there's also just good old-fashioned pollution, right? That like air pollution from cars and coal-powered power plants take a mind-boggling toll. Apparently, up to 8 million people a year die annually from air pollution.
Mm-hmm.
air quality is something that I think most people just don't think about at all until they do. I mean, do you think that just awareness of air quality is something that needs to increase, and that we will all likely in decades to come we should be becoming more cognizant, more attentive, more vigilant in improving air quality?
In the United States, where we have been enjoying, lower air pollution levels, research has shown that we would benefit by lowering them more. That actually, there are a substantial number of people who are still dying in the United States because our air pollution standards are not stringent enough.
Yeah.
If we were actually to make the air cleaner, a lot of people's lives would be saved, even in the United States. So I wish I could tell you, like, this is how we're going to solve air pollution and, millions of people are going to have better lives. I don't know. But I mean, it's not just people dying. It's a whole suite of diseases that are either worsened or you put at greater risk of. I mean, one of the ones that disturbs me the most, I would have to say, is the potential link with Alzheimer's. That you sort of have, the idea is that you kind of have this chronic low-lying inflammation because you're breathing in these little particles, and your airway says like, ugh, like I have to deal with this in the same way you would deal with a virus or what have you. And so, you're just constantly breathing it in, and you have low-level inflammation, and that eventually helps to make things bad for your brain and leads to higher rates of Alzheimer's. I mean, there's still work that has to be done to cement that link, but there's a lot of disturbing evidence about that. So just adding that on to more of the reasons why it would be great to have, to deal with air pollution and also to make the air safer from infection for us.
Yeah. Well, you make a great point that we tended to think of these problems as kind of binary, like either people are dying from air pollution at scale or it's not a problem. Whereas in fact, I think what we're starting to realize is much as we've realized that food, I used to think that I just need to avoid the really bad food. Like there's certain food that's really bad for me. Now I have more of a view, having talked to a lot of scientists about nutrition, that, oh my gosh, there are all these incredible foods that are, nourishing to my microbiome, that can improve my immune system and my moods and do all these wonderful things. And I think it seems that maybe we're moving towards that kind of realization about air quality. And this affects both kind of outside air quality, air pollution, but also how we think about our interior spaces. Like as you were saying earlier in our conversation, we have created environments for pathogens to thrive in our living in buildings. But obviously, we can design those buildings more effectively so that they're healthier.
We certainly can, and it was very interesting working on the book, talking to building engineers and people who are really interested in architectural design on things that can be done. But right now, even after this pandemic, we are kind of in this situation where there's an awareness of just how, risky the air can be in the middle of a pandemic with an airborne disease. But there's not a whole lot of movement towards actually following through to make our buildings safer. And there are things that can be done now. And some of the people who I've written about in the book, they have recently come out with kind of a manifesto saying, like, we need to have building mandates. Here's a list. Here's a list of things that we could just say, like, every new building has to meet these standards. In the same way that you would expect your building, to be built with good rebar, you'd have these expectations that there would be actual mandates. We don't have actual mandates. We have encouragement.
Right. I mean, we've addressed lead paint and a certain set of concerns in our interiors, but air quality seems to be a lagging factor in terms of thinking about how our interior spaces are affecting health. And you, I understand, have a portable CO2 monitor that you've been using. What have you learned from walking around with it? I mean, because that's always struck me, like when you're in in an elevator for a sustained period of time, you're in different environments and you think, well, how, what's happening to the air quality here?
Yeah, it's partly just a way for me to try to keep airborne infection in mind and just to be aware of when I might be putting myself at risk, and partly just kind of, cool science experiment. Because the fact is that we are all exhaling carbon dioxide. And if we happen to be sick with the measles or the flu or chickenpox or COVID or a whole bunch of other things, if we exhale those, those are going to build up as well. So if you're in a poorly ventilated room with a bunch of people, you will, if you have a carbon dioxide meter, you will see it go from under 1,000 to over 1,000, maybe over 2,000 pretty quickly. And that tells you it gives you a rough idea that you might be putting yourself at risk. Now, if you're in a room that has ultraviolet lamps installed, then it's probably not going to be a problem. The CO2 is going to build up, but the UV is going to kill things in the air. So it's not a perfect guide, but when I take it on planes, that's really interesting. As soon as those doors shut and we taxi down the runway and everyone's just breathing in and out and breathing in and out, the CO2 just goes up, 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 which is why I try to wear a mask on planes.
Interesting. But then I think I've heard you say that once the air filtration system kicks in, it descends, yes. Right? Once you're in flight.
Yeah. So that's absolutely true. So I would say the crucial time is when you're on the ground, doors are closed, and their ventilation system hasn't kicked in. Once they go up, then they start circulating stuff and circulating the air, and they do a good job when they're up high.
I'd love to land on a positive notion, which is you say towards the end of the book, you refer to this study by Martin Breed and his colleagues at the University of Adelaide, who tested different aerobiomes on mice. And they found that mice breathing dust from a eucalyptus woodland, that sounds awfully nice, a eucalyptus woodland dust, were meaningfully less anxious than those who inhaled dust from a farmland that presumably had bacteria. And they envisioned a place they called the probiotic city, where parks were infused with beneficial bacteria, right? So maybe we can hopefully build a lot more knowledge about the aerobiome and use that knowledge for good and find ways that there's actually beneficial elements of our aerobiome that we can increase in the vicinity of humans.
Yeah, because, we have been breathing in and out this aerobiome for hundreds of millions of years, ever since our ancestors evolved lungs. And, it's probably not a good idea to just think about this as just nothing but war. And in fact, we know that there are beneficial bacteria and fungi and viruses that live in our guts. We know that. And so, it's possible that, the air we breathe includes, and the life we breathe in particular, can be beneficial to us. And then maybe that when people do studies of, kids growing up on, out in the fresh air in rural areas and so on, and, they have less asthma or allergies and so on, that could in part be because of the aerobiome that they are breathing in, that they are developing this more kind of balanced relationship with all the life around us. It's very early days with these ideas. I don't know when a probiotic city is built. I would love to go visit, maybe live in one, but I'm not holding my breath. Forgive the pun.
Well, I now think of my diet as including the air that I breathe. After this conversation, this just sort of popped in my head. But this is it seems to me that maybe in decades to come, we will think of that which we consume on a daily basis as including the air that we breathe, because it's a form of consumption, and it's critical. Well, thank you so much, Carl, for your time today. What a interesting conversation.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Carl Zimmer's new book, Airborne, is out now. If you'd like to get yourself a copy, there's a link in the episode notes. If you'd like to help us out, please tell a friend about the show. And if you haven't done it yet, leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Search for The Next Big Idea, scroll past the list of episodes, and there you'll find at the bottom ratings and reviews. This really helps other people find the show. Caleb tells me it actually impacts the algorithms. And who knows, we might just read your review on the air. Here are 2 reviews for you. Luke B. Daddy said, "The more I have listened, the more Rufus has interjected the interesting guests with his left-leaning agenda." I am sorry you feel that way, Luke. Though we do like to be transparent with our opinions, it is important to us that this show welcomes curious people from both sides of the aisle. Fortunately, Luke's 2-star rating was offset by the latest review from Nolian, who gave us 5 stars and said, "I listen to a lot of podcasts. This is by far one of the best. Erudite, articulate, enlightening, impartial, and evidence-based." Thank you, Noel. That is what we aspire to. We're so glad you're enjoying it. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. The Next Big Idea is proud to be part of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. See you next week.